On today's Locked On Bucks, it is another trip down memory lane, a Flashback Friday, and the subject you guys were most interested in, Jabari Parker, the saga of Jabari, the number 2 overall pick, the highly touted prospect, the 1 year at Duke, the supposed pairing that we thought we were going to get years in advance with he and Giannis, and none of it came to fruition. So we take a look back at the Milwaukee Bucks tenure of Jabari Parker on today's Locked On Bucks.
You are Locked On Bucks, your daily Milwaukee Bucks podcast, part of the Locked On Podcast Network, your team every day.
The Locked On Bucks, I'm Justin Garcia, joined by Camille Davis. We thank you for making Locked On Bucks your first listen every day, free and available wherever you get your podcasts. And you can find us on YouTube as well, part of the Locked On Podcast Network, your team every day. It's a live show today as well, as it's a top-of-mind topic with Jabari Parker. So we're hoping to hear from you guys throughout the course of this show. Is I think no surprise, he was the leading vote getter for our topics out there with that interview, making the rounds a week or so ago. But curious to hear some of your thoughts on everything we start to dig into here in the timelines with Jabari Parker through the course of this show. Today's Locked On Bucks is brought to you by Prize Picks. It is the easiest and most exciting way to play daily fantasy sports. Just go to prizepicks.com/LockedOnNBA and use the code LockedOnNBA, all lowercase, and get a first deposit match up to $100. All right, Camille, let's dig into the career of Jabari Parker. And there's a number of places to start with this one, but I think it really starts with the hype machine that was surrounding Jabari Parker, and rightfully so. The high school career that he put together at Simeon, he was the most highly touted prospect to come out of Chicago since Derrick Rose. And you look at some of the other guys that attended Simeon along the way. I know Benji, the big 30 for 30 story that they put together, already 10, 15 years ago. Jabari Parker had talked about that at times because he was a Simeon product. Joined that long list of guys that fit that bill. Nick Anderson, one of them. Bobby Simmons, who Bucks fans remember well, and Benji, Ben Wilson. The other big one in terms of the big recruits to come out of Simeon, but it was really Derrick Rose and then Jabari. And Jabari was even more highly rated in his class. Granted, it has to do with who else is out there, but Jabari was more highly rated in his class than Derrick Rose was. And you see this kid on the cover of Sports Illustrated. That's the thing. We can all look back in hindsight, and we'll get to this, and say, well, we knew there was 3 very, very good prospects in that draft. Jabari Parker, some other guy named Joel Embiid, and then Andrew Wiggins, who became the number 1 overall pick. Of those guys, though, I mean, we had the jokes about Maple Jordan with Andrew Wiggins. Joel Embiid was still kind of an unknown. He was at Kansas, but missed most of that season with knee and back injuries. And it was just the intrigue around his size and the tools that he had. Jabari Parker was the guy that was most top of mind for everyone. On the cover of Sports Illustrated, he was the can't miss guy that got all of the attention.
He did. And during that time frame, because that previous Bucks season, which allowed the Bucks to get that number 2 draft spot, wasn't great. Like, I remember turning to draft prospects pretty early on in that particular season, probably around like December. I was like, oh, I can see where this is going. So really started tuning in. And I remember the conversations around Andrew Wiggins as well. People were saying he had a higher ceiling than Jabari Parker. And that was part of the conversation about Jabari or Andrew Wiggins and which one. And from the beginning, I was somebody who was like, I would love to have Jabari Parker on the Bucks. Like, that's who I wanted them to get. So I was like, if the Cavaliers with their 1 spot, if they believe that Andrew Wiggins has the higher ceiling, go ahead and go for that, because I'm hoping Jabari Parker is on the board when the Bucks pick at 2. And I was also hoping at that time that the Bucks did not select Joel Embiid, because I did have some concerns around the injuries and just fit, and thought that Jabari Parker was going to be such a can't miss type of prospect for the team. I mean, he was a forward who was doing things in high school like super great high school career, goes to Duke. I mean, his first game at Duke, he scored over 20 points as a true freshman, which it's not common that you see that happen. He just had like an all-around game that I fell in love with really quickly. And then as we got to know Jabari Parker a little bit more through the draft process, and then once he arrived in Milwaukee, I was like, he also just has like a great personality. He was somebody who was very active. He used his platform to speak on issues that he felt strongly about, which I always loved, in addition to what he did on the court. So when the Milwaukee Bucks selected Jabari Parker, I have a video somewhere online because I was at the Save the Bucks draft party that year of when everybody celebrated selecting Jabari Parker in that 2 spot, and just thinking of the, oh, how is he going to look with Giannis? Like, we're going to have a Robin and Batman with, with Jabari being our guy going forward. Didn't play out that way, but the hope was there at that time.
Yeah. And I mean, it's interesting because you do wonder, and I got the sense the Bucks were going to take Jabari regardless of where they were drafting, 1, 2, or 3, if he was there. But just revisiting that portion of it, some of the changes that we've seen made to the draft lottery through the years, especially the last 3 or so years, how they've kind of leveled out the top of it. I dare say, if that's in place, we're not going to see Andrew Wiggins going to the Cleveland Cavaliers number 1 overall. That's the thing that gets lost in the shuffle a lot. Bucks fans are obviously very familiar with who was where in that draft, but you look back at it, and I think the assumption was like, oh, the Bucks drafted second. Embiid must have went first, and that was the process era 76ers. 76ers won 19 games that year. That was 4 more games than the Bucks won. They had the worst record in the league, and not only worst record in the league, the team that got the number 1 pick won more than twice as many games as the Bucks did. The Cavaliers won 33 games that year and got the number 1 pick and took Andrew Wiggins. So that was the interesting part of it. But as I kind of mentioned there, it did seem as though really early on in the process, the Bucks were locked in on Jabari Parker, that I think there was a little bit of conversation bubbling up among Bucks fans of, I don't know, what about this Embiid guy? Because it was kind of a foregone conclusion. Andrew Wiggins is going to go number 1. We learned that pretty early in the process. So then you shifted your attention to, well, Jabari Parker is a pretty good consolation prize to have here. There's some people that entertain the Joel Embiid conversation, but I think the big piece of it as well was Jabari Parker's interviews and the whole process throughout that draft. Jabari Parker made it known, and part of it was, as we mentioned, he was a Chicago kid, went to Simeon from just over an hour away from where the Bucks would practice and play. Jabari Parker made it very clear, I want to be the number 2 pick. I want to play for the Milwaukee Bucks.
Had on the little green accents with his suit and everything. I remember saying like, Jabari Parker's flirting with Milwaukee too. Like, he wants to come to the city. And as he spent more time here, and I know we're going to get into like the career and the pairing with Giannis in the next segment, but he really did fall in love with the city of Milwaukee. And that's something that stands out to me about his tenure here. Of course, it has the proximity to Chicago. If you're from Chicago, being able to, be an hour and a half away from home, it's comforting to be like, okay, I'm this close to home. People can come up, I can go down, so on and so forth. But I remember he had it was a Players Tribune. I think it was in the 2017 year. And he had an article just saying like, Milwaukee, this is for you. I wish I was out there playing with the guys in this playoff run, but I love this city. Like, I would love to raise my kids here one day. Like, it's that deep how I feel about my connection with the city at this point. So not only like the proximity, but like he really had an affinity for the city of Milwaukee. And at that time, because remember, while he was here, we signed Greg Monroe as well. And that was a big deal because it was a free agent choosing to come to Milwaukee. And for so long, you've heard about people don't want to come to Milwaukee, so on and so forth. So for that number 2 draft pick to come here and fall in love with the city and talk so highly of the city as well, it just felt like a perfect marriage between 2 different, a person in the city, as much as you can have one.
Players Tribune in April of 2017 is when he penned that back when the Players Tribune was much more of a thing. And that was, before every single player and athlete had their own podcast so they could put that story on. We got that from Jabari Parker. And, the other, we'll get to this further down the road, but the loft that Jabari Parker had, and especially when you see the before and after transformation of what he took with that space and turned it into, and I think Donald Driver owns it now that he bought it from Jabari. So a lot to get into, but I think the biggest thing is that pairing and what we thought we were in store for once you started to see the skill set of Giannis and see some of the potential that was in place there for Giannis. You really started to salivate over Giannis and Jabari Parker together. And then, this Chris Middleton guy is pretty good as well. So there was a lot to be excited about in those first few years here in Milwaukee. We will get into that conversation here on the saga of Jabari Parker coming up after the break on Locked On Bucks. Time to talk to you about Prize Picks. They're America's #1 fantasy sports app with more than 5 million members. They are the most fun and exciting way to get in on the action when you watch your favorite sports and players, because you just have to pick more than or less than on 2 or more player stat projections for a shot to win up to 100 times your cash. You could turn $10 into $1,000 in a single game watching your favorite sports this summer. Pick your lineup in as little as 60 seconds, and you're just looking at 2 to 6 player stat projections, and you are locked in. They're America's #1 fantasy sports app with more than 5 million active members. Get in on the daily action with your friends and become part of the Prize Picks community today. And the finals mean more on Prize Picks, so do the star players. You get boosted payouts on select basketball stars you won't find anywhere else. You may just have one more day to take advantage of that. Download the app today. Use the code LOCKEDONNBA for a first deposit match up to $100. That code again, LOCKEDONNBA. Use that when you download the Prize Picks app and get a first deposit match up to $100. Prize Picks, pick more, pick less. It's that easy. All right, Camille, the pairing between Jabari Parker and Giannis Antetokounmpo. You didn't have to sell Bucks fans on Jabari Parker. They knew what to expect coming in. As we mentioned, all the hype surrounding him. We kind of glossed over. He was, I believe, the #2 recruit in the nation. Ended up going to Duke, and we saw quite a few highlight level plays from Jabari Parker back in the days when you could see college highlights and stories about collegiate players on SportsCenter and everywhere else. As a true freshman, he started all 35 games, averaged about 19 points per game, played more than 30 minutes a game. You knew the offense was there. You knew with Jabari Parker, this guy is a bucket. And it wasn't the best comp. It wasn't set in stone. But I think a lot of times, especially as Bucks fans started to dig into Jabari Parker tape and watch his highlights a bit more, the one guy you kept coming back to and thinking, well, I feel like his ceiling offensively is probably this. I don't know about the defense and what that's going to be, was Glenn Robinson. When you think about the way that he played, where he could score from, Jabari Parker was the same guy. He had more athleticism prior to the injuries than Glenn Robinson, but that was the confidence. And just watching him and his skill sets, you felt like we have a guy that is going to be a guaranteed at least 20, hopefully 25 or more points a night.
Yeah, that's how I felt too. I think he can give us at least 20 a game, even as a rookie, which, sometimes that might be too high, but a second round, like a second pick, yeah, I think he got that in him. I like the big dog reference. I remember hearing like some Paul Pierce comparisons as well for their games when he was coming out as well. But it was just the fact for me that he could get his own shot. Like, he can create for himself. He had the athleticism, like you mentioned. Now, it wasn't what Andrew Wiggins had at the time, which was one of the comparison points, but he could still get up there. He could still throw it down. He could shoot from the midi. He could create for himself. He could shoot the three. Like, he just had a really smooth offensive game is the word I would use for it, where it didn't look forced. It felt very natural, just in the flow of things. And looking at it, I was like, okay, I can see him pairing really well with Giannis, because at that time, Giannis wasn't a power forward yet like Giannis was like a 3. Jason Kidd came in and tried him point guard Giannis a little bit as well, with him being a nominal point guard on the court as well. So I was seeing how this pairing could work, thinking, okay, these are our forwards in some kind of combination, because Jabari came out immediately kind of like, okay, you're going to be the 4 on this team. Let's see how this works for you. And that pairing made a lot of sense initially. And it's just so interesting with how Giannis developed as well, where you started to see like, okay, actually maybe Giannis is best at power forward as well as Jabari Parker. But before we even got to that point, his rookie year, when he came in, he was rookie of the month for November. He was sitting here putting together numbers where you're like, I feel really, really good about how this is going, because when he did tear that ACL in his rookie year, the Bucks were already 13-12 when he went down. So they were already 2 wins away from matching their win total from the entire last season. And with that, Jabari Parker started with doubles in 2 of his first 3 games. Like, he was just playing in a way where you were like, we made the right choice. I'm excited to see where this goes. And then there goes the ACL, where when he went down, he was second in the team with minutes per game, right behind Brandon Knight. So he was putting up big minutes and having some really good production. And I remember when he tore that first ACL, it was just so like disheartening to see that moment happen. But to see that Bucks team end up rallying and finishing the year, was a 41-41 that year when they went to the playoffs and they played against the Bulls in the first round, took them to 6 games. And then it was optimism as well. Like, well, wait till Jabari gets back. We already saw the baseline. This team was 500, down the stretch without him. What can they do next year after a little bit of playoff experience going forward? That was Jason Kidd's first season coaching the team as well. So there were a lot of different changes going on, but I remember having that optimism of, when Jabari gets back, we're going to have something here.
Yeah, it was really starting to click, as you mentioned. That was the one thing you really remembered the most. And the Bucks won, ironically enough, that game in Phoenix, which I believe that snapped their streak of losses dating back to what I think it was like 1987 was the last time they won in Phoenix. They won the game where they lost Jabari Parker in the first half of the game to the torn ACL, but that would unfortunately kind of be the trend with Jabari, that you would start to build some momentum and pick up some steam, and then other things would happen along the way. I mean, that really is, I guess, in a nutshell, the career of Jabari Parker, that injuries you can point to, but it was one thing after another. When we talked about the role that Giannis has assumed, maybe not quite to that level of a 2-time league MVP and greatest player in franchise history, but as Giannis was becoming an all-star and the guy, that was supposed to be Jabari Parker. And that was just all of that along the way. Other young players that came into the league, that playoff series against the Chicago Bulls, it was supposed to be Jabari Parker's first taste of the playoffs. This Bucks team won 15 games, and now they're a better team. They're in the playoffs, and they're playing against Jabari Parker's old team, or former city that he rooted for. But it just never came together. And it was just missed opportunities, missed connections, one thing after another, unfortunately, there for Jabari Parker. And, we mentioned earlier in the show, too, that he was on the cover of Sports Illustrated. I think that was November of 2013, on the cover of Sports Illustrated. And do you remember the reason why he was on the cover? I mean, obviously because he was a good basketball player, but the cover story had to do with his faith. Because when you go back and you look at the schools that Jabari had narrowed down to where he was going to play for, Duke, ultimately who he chose, and Mike Krzyzewski for years had a connection of getting kids out of Chicago and bringing them to Duke. I think Corey Maggette is probably the best example of that. John Shire was a Chicago kid, but from the suburbs. But Mike Krzyzewski had that connection there. Duke is where he went. They were obviously one of the finalists. Florida was as well. Michigan State was, and BYU was the other school where you see that list. You think, wait a minute, why? And then, oh, that's right, Jabari on the cover of Sports Illustrated talking about his faith and being a Mormon.
Yeah, and there were questions around that too. Is like, is he going to take a year off and not go to the league right away and do a service year? But faith was always something that really grounded Jabari Parker as well. Like I mentioned earlier, like that was part of what I loved about him, because he lived his life authentically. He was very steadfast in his faith. And as I mentioned, he always used his voice to speak up when he felt it was the time to do so. The way that you worded it, Justin, when you said like, that's kind of like the story of Jabari in Milwaukee, where you see the optimism and then something happens and then you're just like, oh my gosh, like you saying made me go back and just double check, because I remember, because he had the ACL his rookie year. He came back his second year, he came back, I think, in November of that year. He didn't
Played
start
most of the season. Yeah.
Yeah, it was close to the start, but not at the
Yeah.
beginning. And that's the year he played the most games for the Bucks. He played 76 games in his sophomore year with the Bucks. And then his third year is when things really started looking like it was clicking for Jabari. He finally had a summer after his second year where he didn't have to rehab. He was able to do some skill development and just continue training. We've talked about that before, how important it is for players to have their summers so they can continue working on their skills rather than, rehabbing. And then that third year when he was here, he averaged the most minutes per game. He was playing almost 34 minutes a game.
Yeah.
And he averaged over 20. It was the first time he was 20 points or better, and only time in a Milwaukee Bucks uniform. And you really
in the NBA.
Yeah, that is true. Yeah. And it was just like, okay, he's got that first injury behind him. Things are really picking up. And then I was at the game where Chris Middleton returned that year. Chris was so happy to see him come back. And then Jabari tears the ACL in the same leg again. And it just felt like we just saw this happen to him. And I remember feeling so bad for him, because you always hear from athletes of how hard rehab is and how much that weighs on their mental, in addition to the physical aspect of it. And just thinking like another year where things were starting off really well for Jabari, for the Bucks, and then he tears his ACL. Same leg. And then there were questions of like, well, what's going to happen next now? Like, how does he come back from this one? And at that point, you're thinking like, okay, next year is his last year under contract. What's going to happen out of this? But just 2 ACL injuries in the same leg is really, really tough.
Yeah. And I mean, look, it's probably easy to say injuries derailed his career, and they played a huge role in it. It was just a lot of unfortunate events that strung together one after another for Jabari Parker. And even in many ways, it's almost like that friend that you have all throughout your childhood and in high school, and then you go off to college and you just kind of go in 2 separate paths where maybe you check in with that friend every once in a while, but they're off doing that. What, they're doing this now? And I feel like that could have been me. In a lot of ways, that was the Jabari Giannis pairing, because when you go by the numbers and the eye test and everything that we remember from those first few years, they were neck and neck. I mean, there was a lot of Giannis's game that tantalized you, and he was clearly the two-way guy. His defense was obviously much better than Jabari's, but if you go by all the back of the basketball card numbers, they're right there with each other in terms of their point production, everything else. It was neck and neck, where they basically averaged the same amount of points. Even that year where Jabari broke out, same for Giannis. That was in the trend where every single year, all of his numbers kept improving. 23 points a game that Giannis averaged that season. Jabari was at 20. The year prior, Giannis averaged 17. Jabari was at 14. That it was always within that distance, that you had those two guys starting to get better and better, and everything seemingly clicking for Jabari. That season as well, you saw Chris Middleton continue to take that step where he was around 15 points per game. And you started to look at this roster and thought, we got something with these 3 guys. The Greg Monroe piece there, that was Malcolm Brogdon's rookie season as well, that you saw, man, this guy is productive as well. That's when all of this hype really started for this Bucks team, that you had the reasons to be optimistic. Because in the years past, a couple weeks ago when we talked about Brandon Jennings on that episode, you got excited and tantalized over Brandon Jennings, but you also knew, Brandon Jennings, I mean, it's a good player. It's exciting. He's going to take me to the Bradley Center to watch the Bucks.
Yep.
Our ceiling hasn't changed. We're still probably a 7-seed ceiling with this team. But as you started to watch Jabari and Giannis mature, Chris Middleton develop as he did as well, and saw some of the pieces around him, it started to become, we are going to win a first-round series, this year, and it get put off for 2-3 years there. But that's what started to set in of, man, this team, I'm not saying championship, but this team can actually do something now.
Yeah. And that's like, in retrospect, now we can look back and see what happened afterwards and kind of put things in perspective. And thinking about the Jabari tenure and the hype that was building around the Bucks team, like in the 2026 or 2016 season, the Milwaukee Bucks were 33-49. That is the last time, as we record this, that the Bucks had a losing record, just overall to finish the year. Like, it's been that long at this point where we had those years of, man, can we make it to the first round of playoffs? Can we win a first round playoff series? And during Jabari's tenure, the Bucks had that series against the Bulls, as we mentioned, when he wasn't able to play. That next year, as I mentioned, the 33-49 season was the last losing season they had. They didn't make the playoffs. The next year, Barry tears his ACL again, but the Bucks played the Raptors. They lost in 6 games in that series. And then his last year in Milwaukee, that 17-18 year, that's when Jason Kidd was fired. Joe Prunty comes in as the interim head coach. And then the Bucks take the Celtics to 7 in the first round. And before we started recording, you brought up the point, like, Jabari didn't even start throughout that series. And I was like, that is right. Like, he was coming off the bench in that series for the most part. And by that point, there were questions about what does the future of Jabari look like here in Milwaukee. There were rumors about how much money he was looking for, if that was going to be feasible for the Bucks. And there were all these questions, like taking the Celtics to 7, a young Celtics team that had Kyrie at the time, if I remember correctly as well. And it's just like, okay, it was a very hard battle. Like, what comes next? We need a new head coach. We're going to be moving into a new arena soon. What comes next? And then that summer, just the speculation of what happens with Jabari, it was a lot. And I remember when he had his pull up after, and it was like, this feels like this might be the end of the time of Jabari here in Milwaukee, with him having a moment where he invited the community to come and hoop with him just outside. He's like, I'm at this park. Come pull up if you guys want to. And it felt like a goodbye from Jabari to the city at that time in real time.
Yeah, I was going to say it. I remember seeing that exploding over the infancy of Twitter and social media then, and just seeing how much that exploded, that Jabari Parker was doing this, and had the same thought of, because I think most of us, and especially as most all Locked On Bucks watchers and listeners are plugged in, you may have hoped that Jabari Parker would return, but I think if we were being honest with ourselves, we knew this is probably the end of the line. The injuries and everything else, and the fact that the Bucks, didn't use what they could to retain him and just renounced his rights to let him walk. I think you kind of were at peace with this is probably the end of Jabari. So I do want to take a look back at the reaction that we saw to it. I still remember sitting in my apartment and seeing the news that Jabari Parker had signed with the Bulls and thinking good for him, and seeing the reaction from some Bucks fans who were not pleased, and then seeing the figure that Jabari Parker got, but reading the fine print on it. So I do want to get into all of that and continue to take a look at what's essentially the legacy of Jabari Parker, share some stories, that very brief interactions that I had with him as well, and what stood out to me the most that I still remember about Jabari Parker. We'll get into that conversation coming up after the break here on Locked On Bucks. When you're hiring for your small business, you want to find quality professionals that are right for the role. That's why you need to check out LinkedIn Jobs. They have the tools to help you find the right professionals for your team faster and for free. LinkedIn isn't just another job board. They have a vast network of more than 1 billion professionals, which makes it the best place to hire. It gives you access to professionals you cannot find anywhere else. LinkedIn does all of that while making the process easy and intuitive. Hiring is easy when you have that many quality candidates. That 86% of small businesses get a qualified candidate within 24 hours. LinkedIn knows small businesses are wearing so many hats and might not have the time or resources to hire, so they are constantly finding ways to make the process even easier. They even just launched a feature that helps you write job descriptions, making the process easier and quicker. 2.5 million small businesses use LinkedIn for hiring, and you should do the same. Post your job for free at linkedin.com/lockedonnba. That's linkedin.com/lockedonnba to post your job for free. Terms and conditions apply. And if you're watching Fox Sports or ESPN on your TV all day and have to constantly turn down the volume with all the shouting going on, it means it's time to make the switch to Locked On Sports Today. It is a free 24/7 sports streaming channel programmed for you every single day, bringing you the biggest stories without all of the screaming. Locked On Sports Today brings you can't-miss analysis from our local experts, opinions, and news, and it streams 24/7 on YouTube, or the free Amazon Fire TV channels app, part of the Locked On Podcast Network, your team every day. So Camille, Jabari Parker, when he left, and again, I think we kind of realized that was the end, especially as we mentioned that series with the Boston Celtics. He was coming off the bench in that series and trying to carve out his role. As we talked before we started recording, a couple of things stood out to me that, kind of similar to the story that we mentioned about the 2001 Bucks team. We remember it so well, and especially in the case of Jabari Parker, we remember it because it was pretty recent. But even going back and refreshing on some things, you're still struck by, man, that is not what I remember. That is not how I remember that happening. He's 29 years old. He recently turned 29 years old. Jabari Parker is older than Kevon Looney, we were just talking about the other day, which, he still seems like the young Jabari Parker, which is kind of the weird thing of all of it. He's only played 11 career playoff games, and 7 of those came in that first round series with the Bucks. Injuries and just the way the league evolved. I know that's kind of a cop-out response. Whenever people ask, was it injuries? What was it that derailed Jabari Parker's career? It wasn't one thing, right? As our wrestling sickos that are out there, if you're watching the Who Killed WCW series right now, it's a story with that. It wasn't Eric Bischoff. It wasn't the TNT execs. It wasn't AOL Time War. It was all of these things coming together. It wasn't injuries. It wasn't a one-sided game that he had. It wasn't Giannis. It was all of these things that started to come together, unfortunately, for Jabari Parker. And I think the way the league started to transform was one of those things as well, that, we had guys that were, one-way players, but it was starting to dwindle, like the days of Melo, right? Where you knew this guy's out here as a bucket and that's about it. We got other guys that can defend. Even the infamous quote that Jabari Parker had about what he was specifically paid for. That was all
defense.
It was all part of it, of like, why is he no longer in the league? I think it's really all of those things.
I think that's a good point to say it's not just one thing. Of course, injuries did not help. Those were setbacks for him.
Those were definitely the biggest, right?
For sure. And like you mentioned, the league changed. We signed Greg Monroe in the summer of 2015 and was super excited about that signing. And very quickly,
when you realized after a year and a half or 2 years,
exactly,
this is where the league is.
This is not going to work. Like, this is not the type of center that we need with the way the NBA is transitioning now. So it was tough. And then I think too, when you look at Jabari's career, like once he left Milwaukee and he went to Chicago, I remember being happy that he got his bag. Where I'm like, get your money, young man, get your money. But looking at that roster, I was like, okay, they have Lauri Markkanen.
Yeah.
They had just drafted Wendell Carter, if I remember correctly, as well. And then they have Bobby Portis. And I was like, that feels like a log jam at that 4 spot. And I remember that the Bulls were saying, we think Barry can play the 3. But there were just some lines where they had like 3 power forwards on the court. It just didn't work well. And he didn't even last that long in Chicago before he was traded. And then they just kind of started this moment in his career where there's a lot of different stops on the way out of the league. And I think it was, like you said, a combination of things, like going to a situation after Milwaukee where there's a log jam at your position doesn't help. Going then to Washington, like it just didn't click for him. He didn't start any games in Washington. Then he goes to Atlanta, but then he gets traded to Sacramento, and the Sacramento didn't work out. And he gets traded to Boston. And it was just a long line of trying to find a spot, but it just never seemed to happen for him. So when the most recent video that we saw of Jabari Parker came out with him showing the emotion after his first year playing overseas, I was just really struck by that because you don't tend to see athletes with that much emotion, just very raw emotion, very vulnerable in the moment and just crying where he couldn't get the words out. But to hear him say later on, like those were tears of gratitude, like I fell in love with basketball again. That made me happy because my initial reaction of seeing that video was just like, I hope he's okay. I hope he feels love. I hope he has joy because like that's what it's all about. So hearing that he was able to rediscover a love for the game, that's a big one. And that makes me happy about where Jabari is now. I still have the what if questions for his NBA career for sure. Maybe he has another stop in the NBA after putting up some more numbers overseas. But at the end of the day, I just wanted to make sure, I was like, I just want Jabari to be happy with where he is in life. Like, I'm sure it didn't unfold the way he exactly thought that it would, but I'm happy that he still enjoys the game of basketball that has taken him around the world.
Yeah, that last year was an interesting one because again, it wasn't until like February that he got back onto the floor and was able to play. And it was just at that point, Giannis had ascended. Giannis was the guy. And as we mentioned, when you kind of did the side-by-side comparison of the two, it was already trending towards that. But at this point, it was Giannis's team. And Chris Middleton was the guy that was starting to carve out that path of, could this guy be an all-star in the league eventually? He had some bright moments in those final few months with the Bucks. I remember there was the game that he had like 30 plus points late in the season and started to get some more minutes. But as we mentioned, when you just looked at the lineups for the Bucks and their groupings on the floor with Greg Monroe, with Giannis, right where he was, ascending to the level that he was at, you just looked at all of it and said, well, realistically, where's the spot for Jabari Parker with not even Greg Monroe, I should say, with John Henson that was there starting for the Bucks at that point. So you had Henson and Giannis and Chris Middleton, everybody's favorite Tony Snell, that there was no place to start him. So you kind of accepted and knew he's a bench guy. And this is his role. We kind of talked ourselves into, okay, maybe he can carve out a path here and maybe he can be a super sub, a sixth man type of guy, that just what we've kind of seen in recent years from Bobby Portis, ironically enough, that this is maybe the career that Jabari can carve out with us. And there was hope among Bucks fans you could retain him. Was a reserve for basically the rest of his Bucks career that season. And as we mentioned, the 7 games that they played in the playoffs, a few bright spots along the way where you started to see him hit some checkpoints. But when the season ended, the Bucks did give him the qualifying offer so they could match any contract offer that he had. And I do remember being somewhat surprised by that of, okay, maybe this is a sign and trade type of thing where we'll match and we're going to trade you just because of the landscape of the roster and everything else that we just went through. Of your front court is pretty locked in at this point. And it was I think it was a couple of days after that then it was, they've rescinded the qualifying offer. So he is an unrestricted free agent, free to do as he chooses. And once that happened, if you were clinging to any hope that the Bucks were going to work something out with Jabari Parker, that severed it. It was done. And it was very early into free agency that he signed that contract with the Chicago Bulls, which, again, was staggering when you looked at the dollar figures of, wow, as you mentioned, good for you, Jabari, get that money. But as we learned, wasn't fully guaranteed. It was front loaded, all of it. And his tenure with the Bulls, unfortunately, was very short lived. Ironically enough, it included a deal with somebody who we've talked about quite a bit on this show, Bobby Portis. That was the exit for Jabari Parker, traded by the Bulls with Bobby Portis to the Wizards in 2019.
Yeah, it's really interesting that is what Bobby Portis, who, as we know now, is the mayor of Milwaukee. He is somebody who is beloved by the city of Milwaukee as well. But just thinking about Jabari's tenure in Milwaukee, while he was here, I said it often, I was like, Jabari Parker is my favorite Buck. I was like, I'm not saying he's the best on the team, because as we started progressing, I could clearly see that was becoming Giannis. From like, Giannis is the best player. I was like, but Jabari is my favorite. Loved his game. We mentioned like some of the comps we had, the big dog, the Paul Pierce. Carmelo was another one where I kind of see that in his game. And I'm normally somebody who goes for more two-way players as it is. I love defense, but Jabari had something about him when he was on and everything was flowing right and he looked good. I was like, this feels right. Like, I just enjoyed his time here in Milwaukee, and I still have very positive feelings towards Jabari Parker. It wasn't one of those exits from the city, as we mentioned, where he's burning everything down on the way out, feeling some type of way. I do remember when he came back, I think as a member of Chicago Bulls, the first time he played in a Fiserv Forum, where he was like, I've been looking forward to seeing, like, it's really cool seeing how the area is developing. And he even talked like, I'm never going to rule out a chance to come back to Milwaukee because, again, like I mentioned, he really loved the city in addition to just being on the team, being part of the basketball team. He was ingrained into the community as well. He mentioned just, meeting up with people who he met in the city over cars and talking all things just the city, old Milwaukee Bucks team, and how much he enjoyed the people here as well. So, yeah, I think I want to end on a positive note with Jabari, because even though things didn't unfold in Milwaukee the way we thought that it would initially when we took him with that number 2 spot back in 2014, I still have positive feelings around Jabari Parker. And like I said before, I wish the best for him going forward. If he has one more NBA comeback in him, I hope that it works out well for him. I'm not sure how, if I'm not even going to throw out Milwaukee, but maybe I will put it in the universe. Just throw it in the universe in case something comes back that way where he can be a bench guy or something. But
well, we almost saw it. So let's just wrap this part of the conversation up. So after it was a 2-year, $40 million contract that he got from the Bulls, which we were all, wow, staggered by. Good for him. But then as you saw, that second year is not guaranteed. And that's what happened in DC when the Bulls traded him to the Wizards. The Wizards declined that second year of his contract. He went to Atlanta and played with the Hawks, was not on the Hawks team that lost to the Bucks. It was just before that in the playoffs. But again, he suffered some injuries there. Then from there, he went to Sacramento, which I'll be honest, I don't even remember Jabari Parker with the Kings.
He didn't play that much.
Yeah, he did not play that much. I don't even remember seeing the Bucks are playing the Kings. Here's Jabari Parker as a member of it. But just the 1 year that he spent there, did not play that much, waived by the Kings late in the season, and then picked up with the Boston Celtics for the stretch drive and did play in the playoffs, just those 4 games in that series against the Brooklyn Nets, which would have been against the Bucks had they got through that in the second round. But it just lasted a little over a year there with the Celtics in that series, or in his time in Boston, and then went about 18 months without playing before joining FC Barcelona. But there was one other thing in between there. When we thought last summer Jabari Parker was going to be on the Bucks Summer League team, to the point that you made of, hey, it'd be nice to see Jabari back here in Milwaukee. Those were the vibes that were all around Bucks fans last year when you saw Jabari Parker included, because that's how we found out when the Bucks sent out, here's a list of our Summer League roster. You saw Jabari Parker's name on there and thought, wow, okay, interesting. And then you wondered, could he be a bench guy? Could he be a scorer off the bench for this team? Never came together as he pulled out just before Summer League began. And as we learned, ultimately went overseas to play for FC Barcelona. But that was the one missed connection and potentially what might have been with Jabari Parker and potentially returning to Milwaukee.
I mean, we saw it with Brandon Jennings when he had his return a little bit for the Bucks, and he talked a little bit about the Bucks in 6 comments and everything like that. That didn't last too long, but it's something really interesting about seeing Bucks from different eras come and join like a different era of Bucks basketball, where it's like, oh, Brandon Jennings and Giannis are playing together. Didn't see that coming. But yeah, the Summer League thing, I was disappointed when I saw he pulled out, because I was just really curious how that might unfold and if he could have some type of bench role for the team. And like I said, I'm speaking to existence. Maybe that's something that, could still happen. I haven't tapped in too much into how he was looking over there in Barcelona this past season, but we've talked a lot about the Bucks cap situations and type of guys they can sign. Now, he does not help on the defensive end, as we talked about, but for a feel-good story, some scoring off the bench, Jabari Parker could provide that and some limited minutes, if not for the Bucks, maybe for another franchise as well. But Jabari Parker, what could have been with him without the injuries, with things just go a little bit differently? What could have been for his time in Milwaukee? That's something I think about every so often.
Yeah. And as we said, to wrap this on a positive here, that's my experience with Jabari Parker is I started doing the job that I have with the Bucks very, very early into Jabari's time with the Bucks. I believe it was his second year, was my first year on the job. And initially I wasn't doing the post-game show for home games. I would split most of my duties with Dennis Krause. So I would do half of the pregame, I would do half of halftime. Home games, Dennis would do post-game. Road games, I would do post-game. So for home games, back then I had a chance to be in the locker room and be around those guys afterwards. And Jabari Parker was, my experiences with him, an outlier in terms of how athletes carry themselves and their openness and willingness to give some of that to members of the media. That I remember a number of times seeing his interaction with a number of Bucks beat guys, bloggers, as the Bucks were one of the first teams to really usher that era in and say, oh, you have a blog that covers the Bucks? Sure, you can cover us. We'll credential you and welcome you into our locker room. Didn't matter to Jabari Parker. He would give as much time as you wanted to anybody. And I remember a couple of times late in Jabari Parker's time with the Bucks that last season when you knew this might be it. Hearing some of the things that he would do for members of the staff within the Bradley Center at the time, and within the Bucks, smaller level employees that may have been interns and things like that, and what Jabari Parker would do for them kind of struck you. But also knowing I didn't have the career I probably thought I would in Milwaukee. This is probably the end of it. This guy, Giannis, is getting all the attention and everybody's crowded around his locker here. I can't tell you how many times Jabari had a locker next to him that I would see Jabari Parker just clear out and make room for media. No other athlete does that. And I don't mean it as a bad thing, because put yourself in that spot too, where it's like, hey, this is my locker. I'm getting I know you want to talk to him, but I got things to do here. Jabari just instinctively, all right, I know this guy's getting the attention. I'm going to clear out. I'm going to do this. I'll come back later. I remember early in his career too, there were times that you would be in there when there was more and more attention around Jabari and people would approach him. But that's when Giannis was starting to come on. And again, a crowded look where Jabari had to go off and do something else. I remember there was one specific time that there was, I don't remember who it was, but there was somebody that was running a blog from out of state that wasn't at very many Bucks games. And they wanted to get this one-on-one with Jabari Parker. And he comes back from the shower and has to go do some other stuff. And this individual is sitting there wanting to talk to him. He sees something, forgets it, and has to go back, does that, comes back, and 15 minutes or so have passed. This individual has gone off and getting interviews with others. And Jabari Parker sits at his locker, waits for the other interviews. I think it was John Henson and somebody else talking to wrap up. And as everybody's starting to shuffle out of the locker room, Jabari stands up, goes over to this person and says, hey, I know you were waiting for me before. Did you want anything right now? And he had no idea who this was. But I think anybody that was around Jabari has those types of stories, that's just the guy that he was. Things like that, things like the community game, things like, again, we mentioned earlier, buying the warehouse, turning it into a house and a community project, and all of these things that he did. The talent was one thing, but I still think it's really, number one, the person that he was, but also it came at a time when, as we said at the top, Jabari Parker made it known, I want to play for the Bucks. And that was off of a 15-win season when the Bucks were a perennial 8-seeder out of the playoffs. That hearing that too of, oh, this guy wants us too. Okay, I really like this guy. I think that's the whole package with him.
That's a very important part of it, like the love story between the city and him as well. Because like we mentioned, Milwaukee wasn't seen as a desirable location. We have heard for years about how hard it is to get guys to come play in Milwaukee. No one likes Milwaukee. So at first, when you hear somebody say like, no, I actually want to go there, of course, there's like this instant of like, oh, well, I'm interested in this as well because you're interested in what we have going on here. But as he played and you saw the connection grow, and he developed a true love for the city in addition to what he was able to bring on the court when he was able to, it was just like a perfect pairing at a time for this team where I think Bucks fans wanted to feel good about themselves. We were coming off the Save Our Bucks campaign. We had just got new owners, had a new coach. And then shortly after his tenure with the team ended, you get a new arena. So it was all this positive momentum building for the Bucks around that Jabari Parker time. As I said, it's disappointing that he wasn't able to continue on with the team and kind of reap the fruits of like a championship year and so on and so forth. But I feel like that Jabari Parker piece of it is important in how the Bucks continue to build that positive momentum going forward. And I don't know if you get all of that without Jabari's time here, just more attention. Like, does Greg Monroe sign in Milwaukee if he doesn't see the promise of this rookie that's come on, who's coming back from an ACL injury and sees the future and all these guys who are young and growing and developing, as well as the community around the arena, seeing the city itself growing while the team is growing. So yeah, that's part of why Jabari will always be one of my favorite Bucks, just period. That 4-year run that he had here, even though 2 of them ended short with injuries, another 2 were affected by him coming back from those injuries. So much love for Jabari Parker here for me.
Well, and we would be remiss too if we did not mention, I think he was a multi-time, I know it was his last year he was one, but he was a finalist, I believe, a number of times for the NBA Community Outreach Award, the work that he did with MPS through the years. And I think, the other, I forgot about that too. When Jabari Parker returned to Milwaukee the summer of 2020 to take parts and join some of those protests that were taking place that summer of unrest, that this was the community that he recognized and wanted to come back for and support.
Yeah. Because that's his heart. Like, he's always been somebody who does not, people say, oh, athletes should shut up and dribble or whatever the case may be, which I've never subscribed to. But Jabari was an athlete who, before that phrase was even uttered, he made sure that he was going to speak, because athletes do have a platform. And when you care about something, you speak on it. And Milwaukee is a place where it seems like Jabari is always going to have that love for. So you mentioning him coming back in 2020, which is a year where there's no basketball going on at that moment either. So it's not like, oh, I might get back on the team or anything like that. It was purely for the community itself. And that's part of what makes Jabari so special.
I think that's the best way to wrap it. Was you can criticize his game, you can pick out the flaws of Jabari as a basketball player, but he is a very, very special individual in person, and we got a chance to see that for a brief window in Milwaukee. And I think it's a big part of why the sentiment that you've expressed, especially, is I think what a lot of Bucks fans carry is you recognize some of the weaknesses and flaws that were there as a player, but you continue to root for him because of the person that he was and how much he endeared himself to this community and wanted to be viewed as a member of this community, which we're fortunate enough to see a decent amount of that with members of the Bucks and other organizations throughout the state more and more. But again, it was not the norm when Jabari Parker was doing it. And that's what makes him even more special, I think, to Bucks fans and to this community. So a special individual that unfortunately did not have the career that we hoped for, and that I think we all assumed as the number 2 overall pick in the NBA a decade ago. Hard to believe that all of this has transpired in that amount of years. So a fun look back at the Bucks career in general and life to date of Jabari Parker here on today's episode of the show. There's some more news to touch on that we will save for next week's show coming back on Monday. Some more rumblings that we kind of touched on with the assistants and what could happen there. And we may have an NBA champion by the time that we reconvene as well. So we'll get into that conversation and piggyback off of some of what we talked about, analyzing Doc Rivers' comments on that Bill Simmons podcast. We'll save the basketball discussion for next week, but that'll do it for today's show and the look back at Jabari Parker. For Camille, I'm Justin. We'll talk to you once again next week on Locked On Bucks.